After a long delay, I'm happy to introduce the next set of guests for Twin Peaks Conversations. In addition to tonight's episode, I'll be publishing another next week as I catch up with a couple months where I was unable to release anything. These will wrap up the official run of the podcast, but stay tuned because I have several bonus episodes up my sleeve and I've already recorded part of one discussion. For now, I'm belatedly returning the favor that the Twin Peaks podcast extended to me in 2017 when they invited me onto their feed to talk about part 14 of the third season shortly after it aired. Matthew Olson and Ashley Brandt had been hosting their show for close to 2 years at that point, launching in 2015 by running through the entire original series in Fire Walk with Me. Part veteran overview and part intracast. We'll get into the details of that in this conversation. And they covered the new material week to week as it aired on Showtime after they'd finished the old series. They invited a variety of guests to exchange ideas with on these episodes, so initially they had a great rapport between the two of them, and then they expanded it to include others, including, at one point, myself. Like many fans, they were initially disappointed with the two-part finale, though they eventually came around on many aspects of it. For a time, though, their Part 17 and 18 episode was their last, and the feed lay dormant until the pandemic when they revived it for a series of weather reports. Tonight, we'll offer an overview of all of that history with the TV series, their own podcast, and particularly in the Patreon back half, as always, it's reserved for the $5 a month tier. We're going to revisit the finale and the third season as a whole, offering a kind of reunion retrospective in which they get to deep dive into Part 17 and 18 from the vantage point of 6 years later. And related to that, we're also going to discuss the passage of time more generally, because they were once among the youngest podcasters out there, and now they can actually look back over a decade's distance at their early explorations of peaks. So it's an interesting perspective to have. And we're going to also dig deeply into more tangential topics like Neon Genesis Evangelion and Andrei Tarkovsky. Some of this will be excerpted on their own feed, but most of it will be exclusive to Lost in the Movies patrons, and you definitely won't want to miss it. The back part, I think, in particular, they really get to riff and explore, the things that interest them. So it's a great listen. Now, before we kick off this conversation, an update on my own work. As noted, it's been several months since I last uploaded a Twin Peaks conversation, and I ended up bumping up some of the guests that I had planned to hold off on till the fall, including the rare repeat visits, because I had difficulty scheduling a number of other possibilities. Officially then, this and the next episode are the belated April and May rewards. I've shifted my Patreon offerings going forward from June on to include a broader expanse of advance work for the $5 a month tier, so keep an eye out for that. In other words, stuff that I'm working on. If you're a $5 a month member on Patreon, you're going to get some advanced glimpses of that. Meanwhile, the $1 a month tier has access to advanced entries of the Twin Peaks character series, numbers 45 through 31. And on my public site, lostinthemovies.com, I've been publishing entries 3 times a week for the character series until April, leading all the way up to number 46. And I hope to resume with a similar schedule in August, but at the moment, it's on pause. Now, I'm also still stuck on the season 3 finale episode of my public Lost in Twin Peaks podcast series. I'm going to have to compress my season 2 coverage because there isn't enough time to end it by late October, which is the plan, if I stick with the weekly daily schedule that I've been using so far, where I would have a different episode of the TV show each week and I'd go into a different category each day. I'm going to have to put those out multiples at a time to keep up and end when I want to. On the other hand, though, my public podcasts, the other public podcasts I have, the monthly ones, are presently wrapping up. For the Lost in the Movies feed, I published episodes on The Power of Nightmares and Under the Skin in April and May, respectively, before releasing one of my longest episodes, a discussion of Southland Tales with guest Andrew Cook, along with some bonus material, including feedback, an exchange with Vera Drew on this film, and capsules on a couple other Richard Kelly movies. For the Twin Peaks Cinema feed, I shared episodes on Lost Highway and The Straight Story. In addition to status updates tracking my very slow behind-the-scenes progress on various projects, I also shared a previously written review of To Sleep with Anger, the Charles Burnett film, on Wonders in the Dark as part of their Alan Fish Online Film Festival. And I also recorded a lengthy guest appearance on the Twin Peaks Grammar podcast with a previous Conversations guest, Anthony. Finally, around the time this episode is premiering, I should also be beginning work on the Part 6 videos of Journey Through Twin Peaks, finally, after all these years, so that I can start releasing new chapters of that series this summer, so definitely stay tuned for that. And now, on to the discussion with Matt and Ashley, the hosts of Twin Peaks, which was a podcast that I went on, I guess at this point 6 years ago, but I was a listener before that. They started in 2015, and I'm going to let them sort of describe how they came to Twin Peaks and to this particular podcast for those of you in the audience who haven't heard them before or haven't heard them in a while, because it's been a little while since the last weather report, I guess, because they were covering the weather reports of Lynch as well.
I'm Matt Olson, and I'll pass it over to Ashley here in a moment, who I met when we were in college in Portland together, when we first started hanging out and talking about Twin Peaks, watching it together in the Paradox coffee shop. And then eventually Ashley was like, what if we podcast about it? They're supposed to be making new ones soon.
Yeah, I first watched Twin Peaks when I started college, when I moved to the Pacific Northwest, and it definitely had a very specific vibe that I think I really gravitated to as someone who is like new to the Pacific Northwest. And it took me a while to kind of like wrestle with the tone and the weird mashup of like 90s network TV David Lynch sensibilities. But the concept behind the podcast, which we ended up doing a few years after I'd seen it for the first time, was I had not gone past the reveal of who killed Laura Palmer, which I think we ended up the verdict ended up being that you don't really have to watch the back half of season 2 if you don't want to. But the concept was that we were going to rewatch, and Matt, you had already seen the back half of season 2.
Yes, I had seen all of it. I just actually went back to re-listen to a bit of when we had you on, Joel, during the run of season 3, and I gave a Cliff's Notes version of my introduction to Twin Peaks, and I was like, interesting that I decided not to go super personal with it. I don't know if I ever told the story on the podcast, but I had shared that I watched it towards the end of my time in high school, I think the summer before my senior year. It was an event that was precipitated by a trip to North Bend. And at that point, I think if the timing is right, like, and this is a show that we referenced constantly on Twin Peaks, but I think Lost was wrapping up, and being a fan of that show online, you'd hear comparisons made to Twin Peaks all the time. So I already sort of had this thing in the back of my head going like, maybe I should watch this show. Growing up in the Pacific Northwest, specifically in the suburbs of Seattle, about 30 minutes from North Bend, there was a lot of talk of like, that was the show that they filmed there, late 90s, early 2000s. And you wouldn't see a ton of Twin Peaks pastiche around town or like merch, but it was there. And I knew that my mom had been watching the show up until the episode where Bob crawls over the couch and then said, nope. But to return to that trip to North Bend that resulted in me binging through both seasons that were released at the time, age 17, I was dragged / invited to a Battle of the Bands competition or showcase. It wasn't really a battle. It was a showcase being held in North Bend at the sort of North Bend Rec Center by my friend Isaac, who was in one of the bands. And I think it was the first time I'd ever actually like spent any time in North Bend. I've since been back, feels like a dozen times. Apologies for this story going so long. I promise there's a good payoff.
No, that's fine.
We go. The idea was that I was going to. There was going to be a portion where people would sing. It was like live band karaoke, and I had been told by this friend Isaac, like, if you do well enough, you'll win guitar lessons. And I was like, sick. I would like to learn how to play the guitar. I am a white cis male teenager in the Pacific Northwest. Uh, let's fucking jam. Uh, Turns out the guitar lessons I won were a DVD that I never watched. It was not actually a series of actual hands-on lessons. I felt very shortchanged there. But I did, it happened to be the day where I first met I met a girl who I then dated for a very brief period of time. Uh, and in that heady teenage mix of like, this is the first person I'm ever dating, and oh, all of that, I was like, I'm just gonna watch this show. I'm just gonna absorb it, and then of course, immediately like taken in by all of the characters, and 3, 4 episodes in, like all of the mystery being laid out there. And then didn't really think about it until meeting Ashley in college. Um, we watched a couple episodes together. I think that's around the time I actually went back and watched Fire Walk with Me, which I hadn't seen, and had an initial just perplexed reaction to that. And then we did the podcast once we knew that season 3 was on the way.
So that's interesting because it's kind of like you had all the Twin Peaks viewing and the Twin Peaks discussing kind of came in phases. It's like it sounds like Ashley kind of started first, right? And then you joined and then jumped ahead, and then she caught up with you on the show itself, and then you're both going into the return for the first time with everyone. So it's kind of like perfect for Twin Peaks, like not a straightforward journey at all.
Yeah,
Yeah, a lot of
no
hopping around
kidding.
time.
Makes total sense. So tell the listeners a little bit about your approach to the show on Twin Peaks Peaks, because I feel like in a field where it's like, there's got to be 1.5 million, I mean, less hyperbolically, there's hundreds of Twin Peaks podcasts. And I feel like yours definitely had like a distinct voice in that environment. And, you were one of the early ones as well, relatively speaking. But even so, like, I feel like even now it kind of has its own flavor. So I'm going to let you, I guess, describe that through your own eyes and ears. Like, how did you kind of approach it, and how would you describe it to others?
I believe you were the originator of the pitch, and I think you were the one that lobbied for our tagline, which was "Not another Twin Peaks podcast." So I think you should take it away first.
Uh, I mean, it's hard to believe that, but there were already at least, I want to say, half a dozen by the time we started. Um, and someone had already taken Fire Talk with me, which like I am forever like that is the best best Twin Peaks podcast
That is a good one.
title in my opinion. But I think I can say that like I was pretty inspired by Kumail Nanjiani's The X-Files Files, which sort of like inspired the name of our podcast. The X-Files Files also looked back at some of the old forum posts from when the X-Files was airing, and we borrowed that concept. And we looked at some of the old posts from when Twin Peaks was airing. And I think that like the contrast of like Matt knowing what was coming in the back half of season 2 versus me kind of like living in the bliss of like only having watched the everyone's favorite episodes certainly brought something. And I bring a certain sapphic energy to everything that I do. So I don't know how unique that was. I don't know how valid that was, but that's certainly how I approach almost everything.
Throughout, you would have long discussions, but some of those like early ones, even like 3, 4 episodes in, I remember I was like, whoa, this is like, before listening to it, I would like sort of download or whatever and be like, oh wow, this one's over like 2 hours or something. I mean, I think I'm getting that right. But you would go off on tangents, which I kind of love. Like you would go into deep dives of like TV history and like how conventions of writing work and all of that, and then kind of bring it back to the show, which I like, because I feel like um, the tendency is for all of us, and I've done this too, it's sort of focus on the specific episode, make like plot, what happens in that episode, and kind of keep it contained there. But you used it as a springboard for a lot of other topics, I feel like.
Well, that's so sweet of you to say. I think that was something that we were a little self-conscious of as you like develop your voice and like figure out podcasting a bit. I think understanding pacing became really important for us. Matt, I know that you listened to some early episodes recently and you were texting me like a little bit of a play-by-play, and I was a little mortified, but it sounds like, consensus was, Matt and you, that we did okay.
Well, that's another funny thing about it, and something I hope we're going to talk about tonight is, as I mentioned before when we were like setting this up, and this has been a frequent topic with guests I've had lately, is like the passage of time since both since the return and since the announcement of it, because there was also like a period of years where it was like it was coming, but it wasn't quite coming yet, and that it got pushed back a year, and Lynch came and went, and all of that. So there was like this whole experience going through it, and I think at the time, I want to say you guys were probably among the younger like podcast Twin Peaks podcast hosts, probably. Like you're about 10 years younger than I am, so it was sort of interesting to listen and hear. I want to say a different, because I would say we're both millennials, uh
Okay.
the
Yeah.
generation span goes far, but I'm on the older end and you guys are more on the younger end, I think. But it was interesting to sort of hear that perspective of someone, and also like watching it. I think you both like streamed it for the first time, right? Am I right about that?
Yes.
And that was interesting to me too, because I was sort of in between. Like I way missed it when it was first on, but when I did watch it, probably not that long before you, but like 2008, it was like DVDs strictly. Like there was no streaming of it yet. So even that was a little different. But as time goes on, now there's like people coming to it who weren't even like aware of the return when it was on, which is
Yes.
crazy to me. Like they came to it years after that. So it's like it's interesting for you guys, I feel like, to be on that journey. Would you be able to speak to that a little bit, like coming in where you're sort of like the new kids on the block, and now you're sort of like veterans of the whole Twin Peaks world at this point?
Yeah, Matt, I
A
don't know if,
kind thing to
you want
call
to take
us.
this.
Yeah, take your time, think it over. I'll be editing, everything
I'll
together.
I'll,
So
I'll speak to it a little bit.
you don't have to
Yeah.
jump right in.
Um, the the other day I was talking to someone in my I'm currently in a graduate program now. Talk about the passage of time. We started this when we were both underemployed right out of college, and then spanned me moving to New York, Ashley later moving to New York. Uh, the, we'll go into the weird our own revival of the show later during the pandemic, and
Mhm.
the special cases there. But I actually had this idea, had the reference point of the X-Files files uh, to bring to the show, and I think early on the idea was like, yeah, it's going to be interesting to hear us talk about it because we're younger and because we also have this different history with the show where it's like I knew the turn that things were going to take after the reveal in season 2 of Laura's killer. And I luckily I think that ended up proving out to be right. Our legendarily long run times, I don't think were part of the plan at the beginning at all. And I did a couple other shows around the same time. I ended up, doing like I think I topped out at 3 podcasts. And some of that was like almost at the same time. And the dynamic that we had from the get-go with Twin Peaks Peaks was like I was more of the goofball and Ashley was more of the like up on uh both like media theory and criticism, but also just like had a broader, I think, palette of pop culture to draw from than I did. I had the deeper Twin Peaks knowledge, maybe, or at least like I had the foreknowledge of what happens in the later half of season 2. But of those 3, um, shows that I did, this was definitely the one where I was the like if there was a smart person and a dumb person, I was the dumb person in this one. And listening back to those episodes, those early episodes, Ashley, you might have been mortified by some of the things that we said, but it was kind of heartening or heartwarming to hear, and I edited a lot out. I could have edited more from those recordings, but um, it was nice, to feel like we had a rhythm that wasn't just, um, hey, we're just gonna sit here and discuss how weird this show is and how challenging it is. Like we would quickly take the piss out of it when it was, a clunker of an episode, or feel free to switch tracks and do little bits, oftentimes egged on by me as the goofball. But I think when I think back to like I'm sure I did some listening of I know for a fact I listened to the Idle Thumbs, I think Twin Peaks rewatch podcast they called it a little bit to see like what are these guys doing? And that was
Yeah,
not a
me
bad
too.
podcast by any means, but it was like definitely more in the mold of like some folks you don't know on the internet, but who have a profile uh, that exists beyond this show are going to talk to you about this show. That's why
Hmm.
you're interested in listening. And we were just complete newcomers. And to the point that Ashley made, like we had a model we were inspired by. We had the benefit of like, yo, if you go look at those Usenet posts from from around the time of season 1, season 2, there's a lot of wild stuff in there that we could just mine for podcast material. And uh, then it's just a matter of luck that other people found it refreshing and interesting to listen to, even as we went on long, long tangents.
And didn't you have like a food segment as
We
well
did.
that I'm
We
remembering,
had a damn
where you
fine
would
food
like highlight
segment.
local cuisine, especially when you were in the Northwest, I think
Yeah,
initially,
damn
right?
fine food came and
Yeah.
went sort of inconsistently. I happened to go back to the episode. I guess I think it would be the third episode of the series, the original run, where we had our brie and butter baguettes per Ben and Jerry Horn. Yeah, I mean, I think that was probably something that I lobbied for, and that was very silly. But if someone tuned out then, if someone switched off the podcast then, like that was probably the right decision. Uh, if they don't like that, I
And
don't know if they deserve our trenchant analysis.
and people don't know this, but Portland is, in my opinion, the best food city in the United States. Portland has excellent food.
Interesting.
Not, it's not known for its ethnic food, and it wouldn't be, but in terms of just like the quality of food, it's incredible.
Yeah, we were eating good just shopping at the local supermarkets there, and I didn't know until I
Oh
moved
my
away
God,
how
yes.
good we had it. Yeah.
When I moved to New York, people were like, "Oh my God, isn't food in New York so good?" And I was like, Not really. What are you talking about?"
Pizza and bagels, basically.
Yes.
That's what they're really good at. They were very like appetizing. So like if you hadn't eaten when you would listen to them, it was like, okay, now I'm hungry. I feel like they were sort of Twin Peaks themed, right? Like it was something sort of related to, like I remember there were donuts and coffee was a frequent staple and stuff like that. But I seem to remember it having at least using Twin Peaks as a springboard. Am I right in that? Or
If there was something in the episode, that certainly would be our go-to.
so one of the things that was interesting to me too about like the trajectory of it is, again, as you said, like halfway through it kind of became an intro cast because now you were reaching episodes that Ashley hadn't seen before. And for me, it's like as you're listening to any Twin Peaks podcast, you're sort of gauging like, do I agree with this take? Do I disagree? Where are you on board with them? Where are you not? And for me, it's always like you get a little nervous when you're listening to an intro cast or anything where one of the hosts hasn't, at least one of the hosts, sometimes both, haven't seen Firewalk with me before, and
Hmm.
I'm like, because for me it's always kind of a test. It's like if you don't like Firewalk with me, we're gonna have a tough time vibing on Twin Peaks because that's like the heart of it to me. So it was like sort of like nervous, like what do they get? And you guys had like a great episode on that, and I remember it was like kind of a relief of like, oh, okay, good, they're with it. They got it. They were on, and like your view of it as well is like being powerful because it kind of takes where the series was meandering, brings it back to Laura and like this is her story and Cheryl Lee and all of that. So I remember like reaching that and being like, okay, good. But it's like a long journey to get to that with any podcast that goes chronologically. So you always kind of I always would kind of like worry a little bit, like where is this going to end up, especially before the return, because it was like that's going to be the end of this podcast for now. Like, are they going to leave me on that note? Because I did listen to a few early on. Like there was one that was like horrible. Like I actually jumped ahead to their Firewalk with Me episode because they were like they'd already released all of them, and they were just like trashing it, and I was like, and,
Oh,
which rarely happens now. I don't think that happens much, but it was like my stomach just, I'm like, I can't listen to the rest of this podcast if this is
Yeah,
their
yeah.
firewalk they take. But yeah, that film's reputation has improved so much, even in the time I feel like that we've been like following Twin Peaks. Like even since they announced the return, there was like a fortunate kind of turnaround in
Further we get
perspective.
out from, especially the return, the more just incomprehensible it is to me that the film got the reception it did when it came out. It's just like, how did so many people miss what was going on in front of them? I texted actually the other day, unrelated to this, that I've been watching, one of those Criterion Closet pick videos, and Greg
Mhm.
Araki pulled down Firewalk with Me and was like, "This
Yeah, I
is
saw
this is
that.
yes.
Lynch's
Yeah.
masterpiece," and I was like, "Fuck yes, let's go." Um, but again, I say that and I go, as the years wear on, I'm like, how did I not know that the movie was so good when I first watched it? Because I was flummoxed.
Well, right before I watched it, I know you were warning me like, like it might take some thinking about to come around to it. And I watched it and I was like, if this wasn't a Twin Peaks movie, like I would fucking love it. This is exactly my shit. I was watching it just before we started recording because I was watching parts 17 and 18 of The Return, which only ever makes me want to watch Fire Walk with Me again. It's a fantastic standalone
Mhm.
movie. I have no complaints whatsoever, but I can understand. I mean, I think um expectations are such like a tricky beast in general when it comes to media, both in terms of just like kind of abstract hyping of something and maybe it can be hard to live up to something that's just hype without like a little bit of critical substance. And it can be hard to reconcile the expectations of kind of like a Mark Frost network TV uh, take on Twin Peaks. It can be hard to reconcile that with what ended up premiering at Cannes.
Also with like Firewalk with Me, and again, that was an interesting element that Matt was kind of talking about, how he came to enjoy it after not really like it at first, and you were kind of coming into it for the first time like blown away. I feel like I almost had like an odd combination of your experiences the first time I watched it, because I did like it a lot, but I was also kind of like frustrated with it. But my reason for being frustrated was that I was like, all of a sudden I didn't want a Twin Peaks movie. And I was like frustrated with the Twin Peaks parts of it. I was like, this was so good as a portrait of this character that like I almost was like, why was the Red Room and Cooper and all this stuff? And then over time I kind of saw it. I guess I had a more holistic view where I'm like, it's very interesting to me how that movie both stands on its own and is like, the this is a weird analogy. It's like the flower on top of the volcano or whatever that is Twin Peaks. It's like it's built on this whole mountain of previous material that like brought Lynch and the others to the point where it was like, now we want to tell this story. And that's fascinating to me, that it's like it's this standalone work of art that only was arrived at through this long winding journey.
This is gonna sound kind of corny, but like I feel like, now we're 6 years out from the return, like it's still a movie. I probably watch it like once a year at least, and it's like it's a movie that I feel like I do genuinely like more and more each time I watch it. Um,
Mm.
which is like that just it doesn't happen. Like, the first time, another thing that I was reminded of when I went back and listened to some snippets ahead of this talk was like I had seen very little other David Lynch stuff. Um, by the time we started the podcast, and now I've seen everything but Dune. Uh, and the the version of me, that I was hearing talk about my reactions to things like Blue Velvet, or the parts I did and didn't vibe with of Fire Walk with Me is just he's alien to me now, because like I have the Inland Empire Blu-ray sitting on my desk right
Right.
now, and I'm just waiting for the right time to just uh, ruin myself emotionally watching that. Ditto Lost Highway right underneath it. But those movies, which I've seen less, um, by the time I came to them, I liked them right out the gate. But there's something that just endures about Fire Walk with Me. And yeah, expectations is definitely the right way to put it, where it's like my expectations, even knowing going into it blind that it wasn't going to wrap up the series or provide a lot of answers, anything like that. It challenges your expectations right out the gate. I'm sure we talked about smashing the TV and then let's spend some time with Kiefer Sutherland and oh why fuck, what's his name?
Chris Isaac. Chris
Chris
Isaac.
Isaac. Thank you, Ashley. Um, like that's not what anyone is there for to start. And of course now I'm like, whenever I pop it in, I'm like, let's fucking go, Dear Meadow. Like this is the best. So
At that point, when you finished with Fire Walk Me, I think it was 2016, and we had like so there was like a little break. I feel like you found, if I'm remembering right, you found things to record kind of in between, here and there maybe, but it was like, the full return was with the return, season 3, and at that point you built up an audience. You had what was his name, producer of like Chapo Trap House on at one
yeah,
point.
Brendan James,
Like
still
you
a good
had
friend.
people, Brendan James, of course. Yep. Sorry. Yeah. And
Yep.
you had me obviously listening to you guys and happy to come on, and like other people coming and guesting on, I think most episodes, if I remember correctly. And it was like, you had the benefit, I guess, because it took so long to come, to for the production to wind around and get ready for TV. It's like you kind of seasoned yourself at that point. So talk a little bit, if you could, about that experience, about, coming to the, 2 years into this journey and hitting the stride of like, okay, and now Twin Peaks is back and we're covering it week to week with everybody else.
Do you want to start?
Oh, I was gonna say I thought that you could take this because I feel like you were like a bit of a driver when it came to the return because I had just moved to New York. I was like looking for an apartment, and I feel like you were the one like pulling guests for the most part.
I was more settled. Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, I want to do a quick shout out to Scott Benson and Jess Lane, two other recurring
Yes.
guests that we had. Um,
Yeah, Scott was
I
the
believe
first
so.
one,
Yeah.
right?
Another shout out to
Yeah,
Cole
he
Hamilton,
he
Well, you were
did
doing
our
the old
amazing series
series.
art.
Yeah.
I'm just making sure credit where credit is
Mm,
due.
yeah.
of course. Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I had moved out summer of 2016 to New York and was, by extension then a little bit more settled. It's funny to think back, like with the perspective I have now. It's like I wasn't really settled then, but I certainly wasn't, a fresh arrival, just like you were, Ashley, at the start. And we'd already had this thing going, and icebreakers with people I would meet out and about was like, well, I do this Twin Peaks podcast. Maybe you give it a listen. Are you familiar with the show? Are you excited for the new series coming? And I think, and I'm really glad we made this decision. However, we came to it. I can't for the life of me remember, but like I think we had said, hey, we intend to cover season 3 when it comes out. We'd already done our little, location scouting trip report episode of when they were filming in North Bend, midway through the run.
Oh yeah, I remember. Yeah, because it took so long that you were like, yeah, you were like starting out the podcast almost. You were like in the original series, and they were shooting at the same time. It's like crazy how long it took because it's like fall of 2015.
I said during it, 2017, is it really going to take that long to come out? And it's like, oh, you naive child. When the return was about to premiere, that was right around the time that I actually went full time in my first media job. The plan when I moved out to New York was not to start working as a writer or anything of the sort. Uh, Having found myself in that position, having these podcasts already, it was sort of like, okay, well, Ashley, I know that you and I had discussions around that time because you also, this wasn't your only show that you did. You did a show on Keeping Up with the Kardashians with our friend Johnny called The
No,
K-Hole.
I did a true crime podcast with Johnny. I had the Kardashians podcast with a separate friend.
Oh, oh, was that with Taylor?
It started with our friend Taylor. She named the podcast, but Brooke Marine, who is now like the head of the features desk at the Cut, ended up being my co-host for a lot of it.
So much time has passed, I forget these things. But yeah, so you also had three podcasts.
I did.
And I remember we had a couple discussions around that time. It was not long, or maybe it was the thing that precipitated your move out to New York, but you also had a media job. Um, and it was just like, if we're doing these podcasts, and we're on Twitter, if you can tell by the tone of my voice, I'm thinking back now with like, oh, we were so young. Twitter used to be a better place. We were building our brands online. It was like, you kind of want to take it a little bit more seriously, and you want to go, like, this is the thing that I should have in my portfolio, on my website, and on my bio, and promote it, and maybe we'll get lucky and somebody will then either pay us money or uh, fund money to run ads, like make it something that is more professional, which is a trend now that I'm like, one, I'm glad that we never really went whole hog on that for Twin Peaks. We were, I think, also driven by just like, we definitely joked about this actually, is like there were a bunch of other shows that came around, a bunch of other podcasts, ones that were launched by various entertainment verticals just to cover the return, that we were just sort of poo-pooing. We were like, we were here first and we did it better. So let's continue to blow the minds of our loyal listeners. But yeah, we never went so far as to say like, this needs to be a thing that then we're trying to, launch a Patreon for. I think we have had our episodes come out like midweek, like a couple days after the episodes aired on, I think Sundays, and like, you know, that was itself, like, just that decision I think was a good rhythm for it, because it meant in most cases I know I rewatched the episodes almost every time before we recorded. Um, and that meant that like we could percolate on things, we could let things simmer, and just, I think, enjoy it more, and bringing guests in was not necessarily a way to raise the profile of the show. It was nice that we had people on who would then share it around and bring attention to other folks. But like, really, it was like, I wanted to talk to those people about Twin Peaks too. That summer, I did a lot of talking about Twin Peaks outside of that podcast, because it was just, that was the exciting vibe of the summer of 2017. Just getting to watch it piece by piece and talk and theorize and opine about it with your friends was, I can hear my partner in the other room. It's like, that was very early on in us dating. It was like, we were talking about Twin Peaks a lot and watching it together, and it was a great time.
So at the end of this summer, you have this kind of golden summer of Twin Peaks peaking basically, and then you come to this final episode, part 17 and 18, and I'll let you tell the listeners a little bit about how that kind of hit you. And I guess, and this would be something I don't know as much because I was only listening to the reaction on the podcast, but like, how did that kind of impact your overall thoughts about, I guess, Twin Peaks and about your project and other projects and all of that?
I feel like, well, you listened to our reaction to 17 and 18, so I'm a little curious how you remember it, considering you listened to those episodes recently.
Yeah, I didn't listen all the way. sort of just before we sat down to talk now, I was like, let's see what the first 10 minutes of our reaction was. And if you go back and listen, I'm like, I do a lot of table setting to then drop the bomb of we did not like it, and then we start going into why we did not like it. It's funny in hindsight that early on we both start, as we're trying to work through our feelings on it, we explain or we put on a pedestal. We say that a gold standard for a TV finale was Breaking Bad's, and I think that has aged. It hasn't aged like milk, but I think that the finale of Breaking Bad, especially, once you had the amazing El Camino featuring the amazing Robert Forster in one of his last roles, uh, like you had Better Call Saul continuing to become a better and better show over the course of its 6 seasons, and it has a hell of a finale. It's like I didn't know what I was saying then. I didn't, I knew what I felt at the time, and it was kind of startling to listen back to that little snippet and go like, right, we did feel like we were done dirty to some degree, but I couldn't say if by the end of that, it's a 2 hour long episode because of course it is. If by the end we were telling our audience that we felt cheated or that like it made the whole return in hindsight feel like a waste of time or sort of missed potential. I will say that it was not terribly long for me after the end of the return that I just immediately started to go like that was really fucking good though, like not just the time spent watching it and discussing it, but like I'm sure that we rang the like, what is going on with this Dougie Jones uh arc? Why is it taking so long, bell? Maybe not as much as other people did, but like we had our questions about it. And it was not very long after the premiere of The Return, I think. I don't think I'm like doing a revisionist history of my own feelings on it here to come around to me being like, I love that stuff. I love the Vegas stuff. I love the Mitchum brothers. And I have my issues. We just watched part 17 and 18 again. Like I still have my issues with the finale, but and we can maybe get into this, Joel, especially if you have read it or done a deep dive on it. But like the issues I have with the finale are not nearly as severe as I think I've felt they were right after watching it. And like we never did an episode on the final dossier. Ashley, as it happens, now that we don't live in the same place, has my copy of that book.
Yes, I do.
But when I think about some of the things that I'm like, yeah. But when I think about some of the things, and Joel, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on it. Like some of the things that rub me the wrong way about the finale, um, they're sins that I would lay at the foot of that book in part. Because now, if you go and you sort of look for people's takes on the entire series, including Fire Walk with Me, including those books. There's a lot of stuff that's thrown out towards the end of the return that people make very integral to their readings of the series. And I don't know, I don't know if it's my reading of the series or just my feelings on it, but like we don't need to talk about Judy all that much, really. If we're talking about, why I think Twin Peaks
For
matters.
years, still
there
have
we
not actually read it.
I'll get it back eventually.
Yeah, I was gonna say I'm gonna be in New York next month for a friend's wedding. So if you would like me to hand off the book to you, that might be the opportunity.
Maybe
Sounds
we'll
good.
get a reunion episode for that. Which actually, I guess, segue. We are going to get into, I think, a sort of deeper discussion of 17 and 18. And I guess before we get to that, Ashley, did you have anything else to say about that particular episode and that kind of moment? Or
Um, I remember coming around to that last scene a lot faster than the rest of the episode, and having just watched, I actually ended up watching 8, 16, 17, 18, and a little bit of Fire Walk with Me. Um, my evaluation of the return has changed quite a bit, but I remember that scene, that last scene, the bit with like Cheryl Lee as Carrie Page going to the house, the owner of the house identifying herself as Alice Tremond, who bought the house from the Chalfants, like all of these little Fire Walk with Me connections. I remember coming around to that pretty early, and I think yeah, it has. I knew this was going to happen. It has this quality that I would compare to End of Evangelion, which is
Oh, I love it.
my, you know, yes, okay, thank God. I have been weirdly obsessed with Ava since the beginning of COVID. Actually, my two cats who are here are both named after Ava characters. But End of Evangelion is one of those movies that it like lives in your head. It ends on this really confusing, like enigmatic note, and it's in the time afterwards where you're examining that image and what it means, and it evolves and it grows so much. And I think that the return has that same quality. Fire Walk with Me, I think maybe to a certain extent, but I think that final scene with Cheryl Lee screaming, it is so enigmatic. It is so unexplained. I think Fire Walk with Me, despite being uh, maybe historically considered a more confusing aspect of Twin Peaks, I think the ending is easier to digest than the return. And I think it's one of those things that just like it lives in your head, it grows there, um, it takes root there, and that's sort of where Lynch does his best work is in the subconscious.
Yeah, no, that's very well
Yeah.
stated. Yeah, it's funny as far as like End of Evangelion goes. I'll have to send you guys a copy. I did like a video essay years ago of like Neon Genesis and Twin Peaks like side by side. So I
Yes, send
I've
it to
I've
me.
I've long enjoyed the sort of weird um like parallels, I don't know what you'd call them, between this like very differently paced shows, although they also have their longers at times, I guess. But
Yeah.
yeah, well, we can even get into all of that a little in the I'd love to get to that a little in the back half. But before we get to that part, I do want to touch on one more thing along your path, which is you were gone for a while. And I think people, I remember I was a little worried, like, oh man, did they really like, because that was your last episode for a long time. It's like, did that really burn them on Twin Peaks? That's kind of a shame. And I remember like John Bernardi, who has written about like I think every Twin Peaks podcast that has ever been recorded. He has like a
I think
record
that's
of
right.
like all of it. Like he's a madman. But I remember he said something similar of like, gee, I hope that was, they seemed like they were kind of, and then you kind of pop back up during the pandemic. And I think you say in those episodes, like, we did go back eventually and enjoy the finale more and all of that. But you also use David Lynch's weather reports as like a kind of a springboard for your own like cultural weather reports, basically, where you would sort of riff on stuff. So tell us a little more about that and how that came about, and if there are any more of that type of content in the future in your minds, or if you come back again, would it be something different?
I think it's safe to say that we were, like many people, going a little bit loopy in lockdown. Um, I can't remember. It feels the whole idea of just like reviving the feed with something new feels like something that I would have pitched to you,
I
Ashley.
think that's what
But
happened.
um, yeah, but like, and the same is true of like, I had ended the previous shows I had, the other podcasts I had long before that. And with one of them in particular, I had a show that was about racing through Wikipedia, sort of like a
I
sort of Kevin
remember I
Bacon
listened to
style
the Doug
Wikipedia
Funny
gaming.
episode of
Yeah.
that one because I was like, oh, I have to, like, I was like looking at the feed, and that was like one of the recent ones. I was like, okay, I have to hear where like Doug Funny lands in this.
Don't remember doing one on Doug Funny, but thank you, Joel. Yeah, my good friend Caitlin and I did that show, and then after we kind of were like, yeah, let's not do this show. We still keep in touch, and sometimes when we're just on the phone with each other, it feels like and this is the thing, again, I would say the same of Twin Peaks, is that like at its best for the show for me, we didn't have to necessarily be a very different version of ourselves on the mic. And that's not to say that like podcasts where people are professional presenters, or they have a persona, or um, kind of prepare in that way, are not good. But it was something that I liked, a quality I liked with the show. And I think we were just catching up and talking, and I probably was like, what if we just, David Lynch is doing these weather reports again, the things that, were before our time, sort of a legendary early internet obsession of his. Why don't we do that? And then it wasn't very long into like, it'll be a funny bit, and like it'll be a way to like, I don't know, maybe brighten people's days during the early days of COVID, that then there were all these reports and then some sketchy rumors, especially
Mm-hmm.
around, film festivals that shall not be named, that like maybe David had something new in the works. And I think the feeling that we had then was like, especially when there were some hints that like, is this related to Rancho Rosa? Could this possibly be more Twin Peaks? That we were like, well, we gotta keep the feed warm. We gotta think about, does this become a Wisteria podcast? Um, but yeah, I mean, I couldn't for the life of me tell you, I could not sit here and tell you about almost anything that we actually discussed, not Twin Peaks, the other cultural recommendations we made early on those episodes, because I've not gone back to listen to those, and the beginning of the
Yeah.
pandemic is a blur to me now.
So do you think or sorry, no, Ashley, go ahead.
Oh, Matt, I don't know if I want to put you on the spot, and Joel, I don't know if I want to make more work for you if Matt doesn't like me mentioning this, but I did pitch something to him that I am still open to doing. I don't know. Should I mention it, Matt?
I think I know what it is. Does it have to do with something else that's coming back
Yeah.
soon? Yeah, yeah. It's so long as you mentioning it is not taken as me saying, "Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
doing
yeah.
that."
I'll just tantalize Joel a little bit with this, but I pitched to Matt doing a podcast on the Venture Brothers, which is another kind of like post Twin Peaks obsession of mine. Another thing that I came to way later in life, because Matt, I know that you watched it, uh, when it was originally like, I obviously it's still been airing on Adult Swim. It's been airing for 20 years. But you watched it and you hadn't watched the later seasons, and you had kind of had an experience being, a teenage boy fan of the Venture Brothers, and I'd come to it much later from a different perspective. So I thought it would be fun. I'm still really upset that Warner Brothers is putting an end to the Venture Brothers. I'm still living in denial, but I would love to talk about it at length.
Yeah, yeah. So maybe someday. Let's see how the sort of movie that they're releasing actually, how final that actually feels. Ashley and I, we talked about that the other day, and it's like it's been around for 20 years. Could it keep going? I will say,
Hmm.
Joel, you had asked like, do we expect anything more in terms of Twin Peaks peaks? We had promised, I think, at multiple points through the show that we were going to talk about Dune, and I think that came up. I know we talked about the new version of Dune a few times during those weather report episodes. Um, I still have not seen Dune. I've literally been saving it for the idea of like eventually, what if we stop paying to host Twin Peaks peaks, because it
Hmm.
costs money to do so. And we upload a Dune episode as like the final send off, uh, and then have a clean break there. But I also think it would be fairly safe to say, and I'm just going to put this energy out into the world, and then later I'll have my TM sessions about it, try to really manifest it. I think if there's a new David Lynch project for us to sink our teeth into, speaking just for myself, I would be very hard pressed not to feel an urge to talk about it in front of a microphone with Ashley and other good friends, because that's that's the brain that I have now. We did that show at a very particular time in our lives, and in a way, that if we talk about the fact that the website has been around for what, 8 years now, it's like, oh, that's the longest collaboration I've ever been a part of. Thank you, Ashley. But like, the Wisteria thing kind of went cold, and so yeah, maybe we do this Dune episode when you're in town, Ashley, and then we say, hey, John Bernardi or whoever, archive all of this stuff.
Well, we'll hopefully manifest that doesn't happen and that you have something new to talk about, um, as well as Dune. I want to hear the
if it
Dune
was announced
too,
tomorrow
but
and we were doing it, if it was like David's got a show coming out, it was produced in secret. Um, don't need to worry. Like, it was
yeah,
already written and in the can, so he's not scabbing during the writers' strike, which also we support the writers' strike.
Yeah,
Full
did want
stop.
to mention the
Um,
writer's strike though while we've got you here, because it's an important I don't know, maybe I should have prepared this more. There's an interesting blog post that George R. Martin wrote about the writer's strike and kind of like why it's important. Definitely worth checking out.
interesting. I'll link that in the show notes.
Yeah, thank you, John.
Fascinating blog post, and also like I didn't know that he had that much TV room experience back in the day, and it's like, fuck, I wish he had written something about that whole thing, even though he was not anywhere near this show, because it would have informed the things that we were saying back during our run on the original series about, like, you know,
Oh, Matt, I
um,
said George.
Harley Payton, Robert Engels, like the other.
Yes,
Am I getting
yeah.
those names right? Like the other key writers of the original series. I think we would have had a lot more of an informed take on those dynamics had there been something like that George R. Martin post out there. Yeah. But yeah. Oh, if tomorrow it was revealed that there's a new David Lynch project, I ain't killing the feed, that
Well,
quickly.
something
But
interesting
yeah,
too about that is maybe the universe is coming around. The original Twin Peaks was greenlit and developed following, not during, but following the 1988 writers' strike. So maybe, 35 years later, there will
Hmm.
be a
hmm,
recurrence. We can put that out there. So
we can only
before
hope.
we kind of dig into some of the more Twin Peaks focused stuff, I just want you to let the listeners know where they can find you now and follow your work on various subjects or venues and so forth. So just give them a tip for that before we dive into parts 17 and 18 a little more deeply, I think.
Yeah, Matt, do you want to
But
go ahead? Because I'm not as public anymore, but I know that you're still on Twitter somehow.
I am still on Twitter, and it's just my name, Matthew Olson, MatheWolson. Turns out I just registered for a Blue Sky account. I don't know if that's going to be a going concern in the future. Uh, yeah, what a loaded question. Where do they follow my work now? I have basically stepped away from media as a profession while I'm in grad school. For a time, I was writing about games, and then I was writing about AR, VR, and now I'm keeping a kind of quieter profile, I would say. But yeah, I mean, so long as Twitter doesn't become just, it's already a hellhole, but like, morally indefensible to stay on, you'll probably be able to find my account. And then if I'm not there anymore, you'd probably through that account be able to find uh, where I'll be posting about my other work. And so, yeah, if people are interested in, seeing the things that I've been working on in grad school, I need to post more about that. But you know, and I think that probably like every couple months, I probably feel the compulsion to make a Twin Peaks meme or something. I'm still that person. So
Yeah, I'm no longer on Elon Musk's Twitter. It's a slow motion car crash that I almost wish that I was present for, but it's so much better not being part of that. I am on Letterboxd as well as Serialized, where I did log the recent episodes of The Return that I watched, and got some flack for not giving Part 17 a perfect score, which we might talk about a little bit more. But you can find me there, and I've also got an Instagram account for my cats, and that's really like the full friendship experience. If you want to follow my cats on Instagram, it's they're all I talk about. It's Instagram, it's Asuka, Asuka
All right,
dot
I got that
Kauru.
reference.
Yeah, Asuka dot Kauru, spelled Kaworu. They are so cute. They're brother and sister. Kaoru is blind. He's a total doofus. They're so cute. And I'm obsessed with them. So if you want to follow them on Instagram, that's the full friendship experience.
Nice. And do you guys are your other podcast? I know Twin Peaks Peaks, for the moment at least, is still hosted on various or available on various platforms. Wherever you listen to podcasts. Are your other podcasts, are those feeds still out there at least as archives as well?
If anybody knows of a place where they're still available online, not that not that I'm not proud of what those shows were, but if you know of a place where you can still download those, you need to let me know because I need to
I've had that
like
experience.
like
Oh,
nuke it
okay. All
from
right.
orbit.
Well, that,
Yeah.
yeah. I guess that's another inclination.
No one else is supposed to have that. Those are my
Interesting.
files.
Yeah, the K-hole is still up for now, but it's the feed is a lot colder than Twin Peaks Peaks. So if you
Yeah.
want to watch or listen to some very, very old Kardashian discourse, it's out there.
And if you want to stick with the Twin Peaks, you can go to Twin Peaks Peaks, but make sure you spell it right. It's Peaks with the A and then Peaks with the EE for the second Peaks. All right, so let's jump into the part 17 and 18 discussion. We touched on already, but a little more in depth because I am interested in that kind of journey you're talking about, where it's like, uh, even though you've warmed up to a lot of it, there are still parts of it you find kind of frustrating or that you struggle with a little. So we're going to pause there for a moment. You can check out the rest of this conversation on patreon.com/, Lost in the Movies on the $5 a month tier. As noted, I did give a sample to Matt and Ashley to put on their feed, where Ashley is talking about Tarkovsky and Matt is kind of riffing on that, on kind of a bookend on either side of her sort of monologue that she has on that. I thought it was so good. I'm like, I can't keep this just to myself. So they're going to put that up on their feed, but there's still a ton of material, more than is actually in this front half or front part. There's more than that on the Patreon episode. So even putting aside what they put public on their feed, so definitely check that out. This is a great conversation. It really, I feel like, even though it starts strong, it gains steam as it goes along as well. And I get to sit back at a certain point and kind of let them have their like almost a follow-up episode to their old podcast. So this was a great opportunity for me, I think, to revisit people who had not really talked about Twin Peaks for a while and give them the opportunity to do so again. So I hope you enjoyed as well. Definitely check out their podcast, Twin Peaks Peaks. The feed is linked below. Go to patreon.com/Lost in the Movies to hear more of our discussion. And thanks for listening.